Thank you very much, Press Club of India, Anjali in particular, and other members who've joined us. Welcome to this session. I won't call it a session, but as a talk with Dr. Alok Sarin, who's a mental health based in Delhi. He has been active in clinical practice for the last more than 25 years, and he's a leading. He is a consultant psychiatrist at Sitaram Bharti Institute of Science and Research, Delhi, and has been a senior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Sarin. We have been now in this coronavirus pandemic for over 15 months. India has had some of the worst impact of this pandemic in the world. And as first responders, journalists in India have been witness to scenes of calamity, distress, destruction, death, and also the economic impact of this pandemic. Many international studies have been done on the subject, one by the International Center for Journalists, which says that I'll just give you the top line on that, and we'll share these studies with all our members in Press Club, that 82% of the journalists out of 1,400 they polled in 125 countries, 82% reported at least one negative emotional or psychological reaction as a result of the pandemic. Another study done by the Reuters Institute said that 70% of the journalists who the Reuters polled had some levels of psychological distress and responses, and suggest that 26% have clinically significant anxiety compatible with the diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder, which includes symptoms of worry, feeling on edge, insomnia, poor concentration, and fatigue. About 11% of journalists reported prominent symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which included recurrent intrusive thoughts and memories of traumatic COVID-19 related event, and a desire to avoid recollections of the event and feeling of guilt, fear, anger, horror, and shame. Journalists, by their definition, are used to scenes of distress. It's their job. But in this current situation, journalists themselves have been a victim of it. More than 212 people, journalists in India, have died of COVID-19. Many have lost their members, and a very large and significant number of journalists are either under threat or are facing economic hardships because of the impact on the economy. So this is a large, big subject, and there's no better than Dr. Sarin to talk about it. Welcome all once again, and I'll hand over to Dr. Sarin now for his initial statement. Members, please send in your questions if you have. Either you can send us in chat, or some questions which have already come in, we'll take them up later. Thank you very much. Dr. Sarin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the Press Club of India. Thank you very much, Pankaj. Thank you very much, Anjali, for inviting me here today and to speak about the impact of the pandemic on the journalist, on the well-being of the journalist. So the interesting thing about the pandemic, it really has been that, we've been in it now for more than a year. Initially, we were all, while observing it, while being influenced by it, we were all, in a sense, distanced from it. What has happened in this second wave is that nobody is actually distanced from it. Nobody is left unaffected by it. Nobody is left unchanged by it. It would, it would be a euphemism to say that this is perhaps the most extraordinary of times that we are living through at the moment. So I have, so this is, in a sense, this is unprecedented. This is unprecedented for all of us, at least. I mean, it may not be unprecedented in that sense in the history of the world, and we will talk a little bit about that. But in all our experiences, this is an unprecedented time. And it's not as if anybody knows the answers. It's not that we have a formula or shall I say a toolkit which will enable us to deal with this and emerge unscathed from this. This is something that we are going to have to work towards. We'll have to find. This is something that we'll have to feel our way through and try and find the answers. So, Anjali, could I have the presentation, please?
Yes, sure.
If I may. Thank you. So, I have labeled this presentation, the journalist and the pandemic. Pretty obvious, really. Yeah. Could I have the last one, please? The first slide. The first one. No, the first one. The very first one. No, the other way around. Yes. So, on a very personal note, in the last few years, most of the presentations that I have done in the company of this very close friend of mine, a partner in crime, as it were, Dr. Sanjeev Jain. Sanjeev is a professor at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences in Bangalore. And it feels a bit odd for me to be, doing this presentation on my own without having Sanjeev with me, conceptualizing this, working at this, and helping with this. And the fact of the matter is that Sanjeev, a few weeks ago, in fact, more than a few weeks ago, Sanjeev's family stays in Delhi, in Lajpat Nagar. And what happened was that, like many families in Delhi, a few people fell sick. They were tested. This was, if you remember, that strange, unreal time in Delhi when the reports of the test itself would take anything up to 3 to 4 days to come. So the test was done, the report came 4 days later. 3 people were positive: Sanjeev's brother, Sanjeev's mother, Sanjeev's sister-in-law. Initially, it seemed as if everything is, under control. However, as happens with this illness, Sanjeev's brother's condition deteriorated. His oxygen saturations dropped. And then became this mad scramble, which all of us have become familiar with, all of us dread, looking for oxygen concentrators, looking for hospital beds. An oxygen cylinder was obtained. It seemed to work for some time. It didn't work. Beds were being sought. Finally, a bed was found, and he was admitted in a hospital in Dwarka. He was in hospital for 2 days. He seemed to be getting better, and then he expired. The story obviously doesn't end there. The cremating him was itself a surreal, strange experience, and this was followed by the fact that Sanjeev's mother and sister-in-law continued to be sick. They needed oxygen. Oxygen was given, and then it took a few weeks for them to gradually get better, and they did improve. This is actually one story amongst many hundreds of such stories. And I'm sure that all of you are very familiar with many, many such stories. There is the story of my friend Malika Shekhar. Malika is a doctor in London. Her parents fell sick. Her father his condition deteriorated. His oxygen saturation dropped. He needed to be admitted to hospital. He was admitted. He expired. Again, stories like this abound. In a friend's office in Nimhans, Salma works. Salma, during the month of Ramzan, lost 7 family members to the pandemic. I'm sure all of you have read in the papers how these two 21-year-old young men, Joe-Fred and Ralph-Fred, in Meerut, died, I think, within a day or two of each other. And again, these are just small drops in a very, very large ocean. So, in a sense, can I have the next slide, please, Anjali? Thank you. Anjali, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this presentation and this interaction is dedicated to the commemoration of these multiple griefs. Because it is only by recognizing these stories, by telling these stories, by articulating these griefs, that we can ever begin to come to some sort of collective understanding. These stories are all individuals, but unless there is a societal understanding of what it is that has happened, I don't think that we will be in any way able to deal with any of this. These stories all will need to be told. And these stories And the practice of medicine, like the practice of journalism, actually is about both the telling of those stories, the understanding of those stories, and the, how should I say, the unpacking of those stories. So if you were to start with the stories, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. If you were to start with the stories and the stories of pandemics, then clearly we have to start with the story of the previous such pandemic. And this is 1918. This is what is called the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu is called the Spanish flu only because Spain was at that time a country which was reporting its both the cases and the deaths. This was immediately after the First World War, the war to end all wars, as they say. And it spread rapidly across the world. Other countries were not reporting it because, at least other European countries were not reporting their deaths because it was felt that it would be bad for their image. It came to India through the port of Bombay, where most entry into India used to happen at that point of time. And, Sanjeev and myself, we found in the Indian Medical Gazette a couple of papers were written by a member of the then Indian Medical Service, Captain E.S. Phipson, his name was, who wrote his thesis on the management of the Spanish flu, of the Bombay, of what should be called the Bombay influenza, because then as now, the amount of damage that this did to India, the amount of deaths that happened in India were very, very large. And at that point, at least, India, I think, accounted for more than half the deaths worldwide. Can I have the next slide, please? And it's an amazing paper, which is, I think, worth reading by pretty much everybody. Everybody who's lived through this second similar pandemic, at least. It's, the parallels are eerily reminiscent of each other. And so it comes from Bombay, it comes to Bombay, and then from Bombay, it spreads across the length and breadth of the country. That time it spreads through the railway lines, it spreads across. Can I have the next slide, please? There is, like this time, a first wave, and there is, like this time, a second wave of the pandemic. Like this time, the second wave is much, much more deadly than the first wave. It is not yet that apparent, but maybe it will be in time. At least in that wave, the number of deaths was grimly associated with socio-economic distress. So the people who were better off, the Europeans, the Parsis, the Eurasians, the Jews, their numbers were, the number of deaths in those communities was much less. In the, on the last one. In the socio-economically deprived, in the low caste Hindus, as they say, can we just go back to the last one, please? Yeah. It was shockingly high. These numbers were 61.6 per thousand, compared to 8 or 9, the single digit numbers of the first few categories. So as Phipson, with a inimitable turn of phrase, says, those communities whose collective hold on life is known to be slight suffered most during the epidemic, and the converse holds true as well. Could I have the next one, please? Then, as now, there is a state response, and there is a very large public, a civic society response. There are people, there are religious establishments, there are educational establishments which come forth and help the disadvantaged. There are individual citizens who come forth and help the disadvantaged people. Phipson, from his point of view, sees this as a large civil society response, and he actually thinks that in the city of Bombay itself, most people were helped by either the, shall we say, the state machinery, or by the civil society response. There are obviously other versions of this, and there are other ways of looking at this, but this is what Phipson is seeing. Can I have the next one, please? Yeah, this is just a slide which shows us how it travels, and in many ways this changed health, economics, governance, policy over long periods of time. The average height of the Indian declined after this, as shown by census data. Can I have the next one, please? Phipson goes on to say that it may be that that India has suffered, and Bombay has suffered quite a lot, and there's been a very distressing state of affairs, at least as far as the poor of Bombay are concerned. It may be that the future will hold a brighter version than the past has. He ends with saying that in whatever hands her future destinies may lie, let us hope that the lessons of 1918, so hardly learnt, will not be easily forgotten. As we today deal with the fairly devastating impact of the COVID pandemic, almost 100 years after the influenza epidemic of 1918, I think we will have to start thinking about how many of those lessons, what Phipson says, so hardly learnt, I think actually remain hardly learnt. Can I have the next one, please? There has also been, like earlier, like now, in fact, there's been a vast amount of writing. There's been a vast amount of literature, not much actually from India, but a large amount of writing about the 1918 influenza. And there's a wonderful book most must read. It's called The Great Influenza by John Barry. John Barry, in an interview, to the New York Times last year was asked, what is the single most important lesson that you would learn from the 1918 influenza? And John Barry says, it is one. It is tell the truth. I'm not sure whether you can see this on the slide because that font is rather small. But he says that it is tell the truth. At its core, society is based on trust. And whether it is the talking about let's say, even the name, the Spanish influenza, is because Spain was at that point of time talking about what it was experiencing. Other countries were not. And I think, again, specifically for the journalist, specifically for the press, but largely for society as a whole, this is a learning which I think we must hold both valuable and dear. Because if we know what is happening, the possibility of finding our way through, the possibility of dealing with these and making sense of what it means remains. If our trust, and I think that has perhaps been the one large casualty of the pandemic, that if trust in what we are hearing gets eroded, then the damage and the possibility of resolution becomes that much more bleak and that much more difficult. And I think that in that sense, the role of the journalist, the role of the press, the role of the media is something that I think that we will need to think about in many ways. Can I have the next one, please? Pandemics come with their impacts, and amongst those impacts are what have been called by many different names, the shadow pandemics, the parallel pandemics, and one of the shadow pandemics is that of emotional distress, the pandemic of mental health impact, just to recount, the other pandemics or the other impacts will be on livelihood, on economics, on widening, deepening, and making much more clear all the other fault lines which every society has and always has had, and it makes all of those much deeper. But if we are to focus on the emotional distress, the shadow pandemic of emotional distress, then we will remember that the very tools which we need to deal with distress, the very tools that we need to deal with disaster, the very tools that we need to deal with trauma, which is social connectedness, which is the support and the presence of other people around us, is exactly what, in a sense, the pandemic takes away from us. Because that sense of community, that sense of interconnectedness, that sense of being with people is what the pandemic, the 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 fear of contagion, the if we start distrusting or fearing the proximity of other people, uh, and in many ways, the social distancing, while it is necessary, will do exactly that. It makes me avoid others, and it's like all those bits about mythology कि आपके पास ये अस्त्र होगा, ये ब्रह्मास्त्र होगा, और जब आपको सबसे ज्यादा इस चीज की जरूरत पड़ेगी तब आप इस अस्त्र को इस्तेमाल नहीं कर पाएंगे। इस समय जब हमें दूसरों की, समाज की सबसे ज्यादा जरूरत है, वो हमारे साथ नहीं है। The times that we need that social connectedness the most, the times that we need to make sense of those griefs. So, people have died. We all know people who have died. Family members, friends, colleagues, workmates, neighbors. What is it that we do normally? We visit. We be with them. Our presence is solace. Our presence is succor. And that presence is now absent. That is what the pandemic actually has done to us. So not only has it increased the traumas manifold, it has taken away from us the very tools which we would normally have used to deal with these traumas. Can I have the next one, please? Grief. Grief is a very large, very complex subject on its own. And there is no way that we are going to be able to unpack the dealings with grief in a brief presentation. But let us remember that there are ways, both individual and collective, of dealing with grief. And it is not that it has to be one or the other. The one has to be supported by the other. There has to be an individual attempt at resolution. That there has to be a collective attempt at resolution. And when grief, when bereavement, when loss is on this large scale, then the need for that individual story to be shared with the collective and for the collective to invest in the individual is where perhaps some of these possible answers might lie. The balance is also between grieving and resolution. How much of mind space do I invest in the sadness and how much do I move forward? What are the balances that the individual make? What are the balances that society as a group will make? Are things that I think that we need to think about. We also need to remember that grief is always complicated. In sometimes very much more, in sometimes less so. Some narratives will be simpler. The narrative of a 92-year person, an old person who has lived a full life, who dies calmly at home, surrounded by family. The narrative of somebody who dies gasping for breath because they couldn't find oxygen, somebody who dies at home because a bed was not available, somebody who dies because we believe that appropriate treatment did not happen, is tinged with regret, anger, sadness, loss in varying degrees. And those are things that I think that we will have to try and make sense of. The multiplicity of the forms of support. So I was just thinking about the journalist, or about the doctor. So the grief of somebody who loses a family member, the grief of somebody who, in the course of their work, is witness to scenes of death and devastation, which you would think that, normally no human being should have to witness, that these scenes should not happen. But the fact of the matter is that they do, and they are, and they have to be witnessed. And what is the nature of the support? And that support, in a sense, is bidirectional. The person who is the support is not immune to those griefs, because the grief at the moment, the loss is so widespread. It's like a friend of mine was saying, it's like a planet in mourning. Will the support that I offer and render help the person that I am supporting, or will it help me? Or will it do both? And there's a very important concept, which we came across when we were studying what happened during the aftermath of the partition of India. And this is the bearing of witness, that very often what support looks like is the bearing of witness, is the telling of that story. And that itself is a very important part. Can I have the next one, please? So the learnings, what are the learnings? The learnings are that the penetrations of science and medicine as a social imperative, and not only as something that is available to the privileged, but as a public common, is something that perhaps has not been encouraged. And this is something that we might want to think about. That this is something that should be and needs to be available to all of us, regardless of who we are and where we are. And that what the virus has done is opened up so many fault lines, so many areas of difficulty, that I think we need to start with thinking about all of this. Can I have the next one, please? Amy Poehler is an American actress. She's been involved with what is called improv theater, and not specifically in the context of the pandemic, but in the context of life. She said that the only way that we will survive is by being kind. The only way that we can get by in this world is through the help we receive from others. No one can do it alone, no matter how great the machines. And I think that today, more than ever, this, in a sense, holds true. Both for the recipient and for the donor of the kindness. I think both perhaps need it as much, if not more than ever. And can I have the last slide, please? The last slide is again simple. During the pandemic, many people have been reading lots of stuff about contagion and infections and the plague. And there's this bit in the Plague by Camus, which says, in which the Dr. Roux says, the whole thing is not about heroism. It may seem a ridiculous idea, but the only way to fight the plague is with decency. So somebody says, what is this decency? And he answers, it's doing my job. So wherever we are, whatever we are doing, I think perhaps that decency is what we need to keep in mind and hold on to. And maybe in those decencies, the collective can emerge. So thank you very much for your patience. Anjali, thank you so much for the technological assistance, and maybe we could switch the screen sharing off now and perhaps look at each other. Thank you so much.
Sarin, 2-3 things which we can take away from this initial interaction you had with us is, it is recorded, the damage becomes much more difficult. So trust between the state, the nation, the people, and we are in the business of trust, journalists. People trust us, and that's how we do our jobs. And doing my job, it connects to that. That to be decent is just keep doing your job, and our job is basically to report how this pandemic is panning out. Another insight I can say is that is about the Brahmastra against mental instability, which is social connection and social support, cannot be used today in this pandemic, and that is very acute among journalists, because people aren't even going to their offices anymore. So earlier, if you go and report on a riot, on a death, on a cataclysmic event, we used to go to the newsroom and discuss with other people. Today I saw this. I remember as a 21-year-old, my first task as a journalist was to go to St. Stephen's College morgue and count all the dead bodies during 1984 riots. And I can never etch that image, is totally etched in my mind even today, 40 years on. And but I had the luxury of going to the office and discussing that particular scene I saw with the rest of the colleagues. Another thing is about grief. Most of us are, I think, Doctor, we are postponing our grief. As we were getting into this discussion today, I just got an SMS from a friend of mine in Mathura, my hometown, that one of our college mates had died. And I just postponed it. And I told him, I'll talk to you after this webinar. So share, don't postpone that grief. If you have been victim, if you have seen something horrific, if you've experienced something grievous, mourn it and share it. That's why I think I'll share it right now. And another thing I want to share with all of you is this research done by International Federation of Journalists, that information, most of the journalists are feeling that there's too much misinformation and disinformation in the system, and about 46% of them, and this is a huge number of people, they have polled 1,400, and half of them have said that politicians and elected officials were identified by our respondents as a top source of disinformation, along with government agencies and their representatives, which is 25%. Some more headlines here, which can be part of your questions, if you have any, that press freedom violations have increased in the world. 48% of respondents to this survey by IFCJ have said that speaking to journalists, that their sources have expressed fear of retaliation while speaking to journalists in connection with COVID-19. So it's the hospital doctors, it's the nurses, it's the bureaucrats we know as our sources who are trying to tell us the truth. They feel retaliation and we feel scared as journalists. Another big thing is about financial viability or unviability, that half of the respondents to this survey, journalists, all of them in managerial posts, reporters, desk people, they've said that half of them say that their companies are feeling a cost cutting to the extent of 75%. Revenues have been cut. And 89% reported that they have faced, or their colleagues have faced, these job cuts. So there's another dimension to this pandemic on journalists. There's some good news also, and I'm sure most of us have encountered this good news, that 43% of the journalists are now saying that the audience trust has gone up in journalism. The audience trust has gone up in their work. People are trusting journalists more in this pandemic. And that is a very positive thing. 38% are saying that they had experienced increased audience engagement. People are talking. People are giving feedback. They are engaging. And 61% expressed an increased commitment to journalism from themselves after seeing this pandemic and witnessing this pandemic. So these are the good things also which have come up in this study. And one question before my experience in anchoring is that first question no one asks, and then everyone wants to ask two questions. So questions have started coming. I don't know who this person is because the name is Don YK. Currently, waking up each morning is a surreal experience for voting. Being able to brush it off after a few minutes, it is now beginning to normalize as the base attitude. Strangely, rather than making this difficult for us to tackle other problems, one finds that other more normal problems are a welcome distraction and enable better focus. Solving a daily issue seems to give us a reassurance. What does this say about a possible emotional reset after this prolonged stress time? So this is a question for you, Dr. Sarin, and it's connected to the question of dehumanizing and desensitizing of journalists, particularly in this pandemic.
Yes. At the moment, it's like a society in experiencing anxiety symptoms. There was a op-ed in the papers, I think Karan Thapar, about a week ago, talking about how waking up in the morning, exactly what Donnie is saying about waking up in the morning with the sense of foreboding, with the sense of anxiety, has become the new normal. there are a number of people who've talked about this. Ki you dread waking up in the morning. Ki aaj ka din kya dikhayega? Who is it? You don't want to look at the newspaper because the death announcements invariably. Firstly, there are very many more than there would normally be, and you dread to see who it is amongst the obituaries is somebody that is known to you. How do we deal with this? There is no formulaic answer, and there cannot be. And we will all, in a sense, have to find our own answers. We'll have to find our own answers depending on who we are, what we are, the way that we solve our problems, the way that we find and we work towards resolution. So there'll be some things which are common sense. Many of my colleagues will refer to this as what's called low-hanging fruit. Have a sense of routine, exercise regularly, try and stay away from the more distressing parts of the news. Family and friends, and all of this makes sense. All of this is important. All of this is real. All of this is precious. All of this has value. There is absolutely no doubt about any of this. In a larger sense, for societies to heal, society has to also acknowledge this. And in some ways at least, it is about that, and this is perhaps in different parts, it is about the recording of this, the chronicling of this, the bearing witness, as it were, and it is about honoring the collective, the doing of something. My sense is that if we are able to reach out and help in whatever way, that way could be, as Pankaj said, doing my job. As Dr. Rowe in the plague says, that decency is doing my job. But if I am able to do that job, and this is what I was talking about, is that bidirectionality. If I do the decent thing, what we are calling the decent thing, as it were, then it will help. It will help society, and it will help me. And by helping me will help society. The one thing that the pandemic, many things it has taught us, some things we make sense of it as we go along. The interconnectedness of things, the fact that if my well-being and my sense of self is being so severely threatened by something that has happened hundreds of thousands of miles away, something that has happened to change the ecostructure of the planet, then it is perhaps time for me to not limit my concerns to self. It is time for me to start thinking larger, to start thinking about both, in a sense, the other person, and in a sense, the rest of the planet as well. So
that takes us
that reset. Sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, so that reset will obviously take many different ways. And in many ways, this is exactly what Swipson was saying, in 1918. Those lessons which we have suffered so much in experiencing, which of those lessons are we going to learn? So it's a question which I suppose we will have to ask ourselves in the fullness of time. How much of this have we learned? I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Pankaj.
No, I was coming to the next question. Connectedness. We talk about as a Brahmastra. Social connectedness, social connection, social support are this thing. We thought that the social media will provide us that, but here Vichitra is asking us that in 1989, 18, there was no social media. Now very difficult to counter fake stuff on social media. And the research is also telling us that 66% journalists are today saying globally that Facebook is one of the largest carriers of disinformation. And most of the women journalists, especially in India, this study, by the way, the second highest number of journalists responded from India and after the UK. And they are saying that most of the women journalists are being trolled when they are doing their job, what we just talked about, doing my job. So, and that's another question is about that the job of the journalist to tell people what's happening. And if you can't do that, you are trolled for that. And public authorities are publicly shaming you on that and publicly questioning on you that, then how do you do this? How do you do your job?
Which is why support is needed. Which is why support both from peers, both from colleagues, both from institutions and systems is necessary. The doing of the job, even in normal times, is not easy. And in difficult times, the fact that it is difficult is obvious. For some people, that reset might be stepping back when overwhelmed and then coming to it again. In many ways, it is as much for the individual and it is as much for the collective to find those answers. It also seems, that saying this means because the collective is not doing it, so therefore it is not going to happen. And so this is a way of finessing, and that this is a way of avoiding the fact. So in that sense, I suppose each of us does what one can, keeping in mind the maintenance of that equipoise of taking care of self while doing as much as one can for the collective, as it were. And again, for somebody, it might actually be the going out and delivering food to people in need. For some, it might be the doing of the job. For some people, it might be donation. For some people, it might be building awareness. For some people, it might be helping others find resource. But until such time that many more of us come to some sense of that awareness and perhaps act upon it, this may not change. So maybe we need to talk about it a little bit more to bring about that change, I guess.
Donnie here has just said that he lost his dog during this pandemic, and now he uh, uh, gives me the best feeling of the day is when he goes out and feeds his dog's friends, or the stray dogs. Giving is a good policy to maintain sanity. Very good, Donny. Another question is from Dinesh that media is doing its job by reporting stories from the ground zero. Social media in this pandemic has provided helping hand, but more needs to be done so it more in a more systemic sort of way and more credible. Uh, what more the media fraternity can do?
So it's in a sense, this is not a question that uh, somebody from outside the media can and should answer or should comment upon. I don't know. It is it is something that I think we'll have to think about. It is something that it's like saying that what more does the medical community have to do? Yeah. Uh, and we know that, in many ways the medical community has done a lot. In many ways, uh, you know, the the business about guidelines about yesterday hydroxychloroquine being uh, propagated, or plasma therapy being propagated, and today exactly all of that uh, uh, not being so. Uh, does this mean that medicine is the problem? No. Does this mean that between the theories of medicine and the practice of medicine, that there is a difference? And the answer is yes, of course there will be. Between science and scientist, there will be a difference. And so in many ways, the way that progress happens is untidy. There will be steps, there will be missteps, there will be hopefully a recognition of that misstep, and there will be even more hopefully that course correction. To expect that in times of distress, in times of difficulty, in times of global difficulty of this nature, that mistakes will not happen is naive. It is not going to happen. But what is not naive is expecting an awareness of it when things go wrong. So if those, if we can learn from things that go wrong, then perhaps there is hope. And the fact is that there always will be hope. There will never be a linear trajectory. So, it's not that social media is good or social media is bad. It's a tool. It has been used for very many really beneficial things, and it's been used for very many really problematic things as well. The tool and the wielder of the tool are two different things. In that sense, for us as parts of those systems and parts of subsystems within those systems, to be thinking about the ways that we go forward, and critically about the ways that we go forward, is perhaps the need. And if we can do this, sure, many things will happen. I mean, there's a question here which says, what did society look like after the influenza pandemic of 1918? And the answer is not one. The answer is not that that a thing happened, that it was good or bad or ugly. Some good things happened. The Indian medical service got strengthened. Some really bad things happened. The imperial power got that much more deeply entrenched. If you read Phipson's report, and as we've commented in our paper, it seems as if everything is rosy. But if you look at the larger picture, then this is also the time that Jallianwala Bagh happened, the Mopla Rebellion happened, the very public boycott of the royal visit happened immediately after this. So good and bad things happened. What happened after the Holocaust? Terrible things happened during the Holocaust, and in a sense, the science of bioethics was built on the ashes of the Nuremberg trials. So many things that are potential are possible. It depends on where we take this and what sort of engagement we have. What this has done is make clear that public health has been neglected for far too long. I think we are focused very much on the privatization of health services, and the very obvious limitations of that have been fairly clearly exposed. The need for a robust public health system, the need for thinking about this, the need for critically evaluating where we stand, at least as far as health delivery is concerned, to begin with, is perhaps one of the things that we need to address.
We've got question. One last question I'll ask you. I mean, when we're talking about journalists doing their job, and the job is become quite grotesque these days. I mean, we have people reporting from cremation grounds. People are reporting from burial grounds. There are burial grounds which are not official. I mean, even a bank of a river is an open burial ground, and and it is. वो कहते हैं ना कि ये तस्वीरें आपको विचलित कर सकती हैं. So if you look at the television medium these days, the newspapers, and they are full of that. And some of the psychiatrist leaders in the country, they have also written about it. They have written a letter to the media fraternity about toning it down. I mean, they did not use the word, but toning it down. It had a very bad, acrimonious report after they wrote that letter. Between what a journalist watches, a journalist censors a lot, because it's indecency. The press council directives are there. The news broadcasters associations directives are there that should be decent. But when the reality is so indecent, what is the option to a journalist?
Yes, this is obviously a difficult question, and I'm not sure that I have, Pankaj-ji, an answer to this. The fact that a balance between truth-telling, meaning-making, and avoiding sensationalism should be drawn seems clear, but where is it that we will draw those lines is something that I think we need to reflect upon. I must also say that the letter in question, and I'm sure most journalists have read it, is written by fairly senior people, but it's written by fairly senior people in their individual capacities. Let me say fairly senior people who are very good friends, but it's written by fairly senior people in their individual capacities. It's not as if the Indian Psychiatric Society has had a discussion and said that this is the position, or the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences has said so. And my sense is that many people will draw those lines perhaps slightly differently. My personal view is that it should veer very much towards the truth-telling and meaning-making side of the position. But in a sense, what this reminds us is that an awareness of that balance is necessary. Where we draw those lines, I think, my personal belief is that those stories need to be told. If we don't tell those stories, we will perhaps be doing both ourselves and society and our professions, both my profession and yours, a disservice.
That's very sobering thought to end it on. And I still remember, I'll go back to my own experience in this thing. Martin Bell, one of the greatest BBC reporters, was covering Sarajevo and Bosnia. And I remember that most of his stories from the scenes of the massacres, but he will never show a dead body. He'll stand there and he'll explain and describe that I'm standing in this basement and the stench is overbearing and there are 36 dead bodies around me, and these people have been either gassed or they died of but that is where this whole profession of journalism, I think we can bring it back, that we can tell the truth without telling the gory details, without being indecent. And it's very sad day today that the difference between the two has come into whether you show dead bodies lying on the bank of a river, and you decide in decency that you will not show the dogs eating that. So that's where we are as a society. That's the line today in journalism. There are more questions coming in. How long can we talk for Dr. Sarin?
I'm okay.
Okay. So I have a question here. Yeah. So one question for me. So a lot of people have shared how they are facing problems in their daily life and getting up in the morning. There's anxiety, there are lots of issues. What is that point? How do we evaluate, or where do we realize that we now need professional help, we need medical help? What is that point? How does one get to know that?
So this is a question I think that many of us, Anjali, will ask ourselves, and it's a difficult question to answer. The thing is that the way that we decide on pathology is that it is outside the ordinary, that this is something which is not understandable, or this is not something that is justified depending on the situation, which by the way in itself is a limited and perhaps not completely accurate understanding also. So I would say that if the distress is persistent, is continuous, is affecting my quality of life, is affecting my ability to function, then I need to take this seriously, which doesn't mean that I rush out and start prescribing or start looking for prescriptions of an antidepressant. No. In fact, for the majority, medical intervention is perhaps not the answer. I think that if I recognize that that things are not quite okay, then I perhaps need to, let us say, first step back a little bit. I need to see whether I am doing as much what we call self-care or not. What are the things that I can do to take care of myself? And within that, there will be routines of activity, some exercise routines, the spending time, as we said earlier, with friends, with family. And I think that perhaps for many of us, that might actually work.
Yeah, that's
many people. Sorry.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, for many people, talking to somebody who's sympathetic, who's supportive, will actually work. For many people, the doing of something, of not seeing myself as only the recipient of ill fortune. You know what Donnie said earlier? Feeling overwhelmed by the loss and the doing of something, of changing that narrative from narratives of loss to narratives of giving support. So the giving of support helps the giver. So there are many things that I can do. And let me say that I believe that for the majority, that is perhaps all that is needed. It is not necessary that कि सबको antidepressant खाना चाहिए.
That's a good thing, and
बिल्कुल
you can talk to Anjali and other members of the managing committee. You can talk to the press club managing committee. We can make this kind of an interaction weekly or fortnightly affair, where we can talk to each other, we can talk to experts, get some answers. I personally feel that not being able to come to press club and talk to our colleagues and our friends shouldn't hamper us in this task, and we can start something on a fortnightly basis, just to meet here, talk to people, get more experts, and tell your stories. I'm sure Jan was supposed to be very cagey about their sources, but today I think they've been very cagey about their questions. And next time it will not be so. We are in the job of asking questions. We have one of the best persons to answer those questions, and I'm sure that in the future we'll be able to get the answers to that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Sarin. Thank you, Press Club of India.